Alrighty, welcome back to another video. And now that we have the basic application framework taken care of, in other words, we have an icon that we can click and it displays the app. What I want to do now is start building out the UI. Now, when creating apps, I like to build out the UI first before I write any of the JavaScript, React, Redux logic. And the reason for that is because once I have the UI and then I go in and start, testing out, building out all the logic, the UI acts as like a really clear visual indicator to verify that these things are working correctly. Now, some people write the code first and then add the UI in after that, but for me, it's just a lot easier to build this way. So with that said, like I said, I'm going to be working on the UI first. And the way that I'm going to approach this is I am first going to write some very basic containers just to get the main structure kind of appearing on the screen. And then once I have the main structure, then I'll go back to each of those components and start styling them with, the right colors and font sizes, this and that. But kind of like building a house, you build the framework first, or the foundation in the frame, and then you can go in and, paint the walls and add the carpeting, so on and so forth. So with that said, I'll show you how I am going to lay out this basic structure. Of course, this main container right here, I'll keep it a flex. And what I'm going to do is just stack everything up into a single column. And for those things that I'm going to stack, I'm going to break it up like this. I'm going to have one container that's going to contain all these components, and I'm going to call this the top. And then under that, I'm going to have this container, which I'll just call probably connection status. Now under that, I'll have this, and this is going to be a simple one. I'll call it the main button. Under that, I'm going to have this timer. And then under that, I'll include all of these components into one container called history. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I would say like main containers that we have to build. And then once we have that, like I said, I'll go back and kind of style everything looking nice and pretty. But that is what we're going to do. So let me go ahead and get started. All right, so to do this, I'm going to go in my speed test and go in containers. Now, the first one that I want to build is just called top, and that is going to be for this, or should I say these items right here. And for making this container, again, I'm going to nest it inside this containers directory. And for each of these, I'm going to create this component file. And we already talked about what all these are. The only thing I have to do here is just replace this component name with top. And this is just going to be basic text right now. And then this is also going to include a styles file. So once I have this very generic container, I'm going to go ahead and import it into my top level container right here. And in order to do that, I'm just going to import top from apps, speed test, containers, top. All right. So this is pretty much what I'm going to do for all of these kind of top level items. I'm going to make one more real quick just so we can kind of get the hang of it. And then I'll probably just fast forward the video so you don't have to see me do the exact same thing again and again and again. But, you can just stick around with me for a little bit. So under this top section right here, we're just going to have this connection status. So I will call this connection status, and I'll actually copy this because we're going to need it in just a second. So of course, same as the top directory, it's going to contain two files. One is this component file or index, and then it's going to contain a styles file, which we're going to be filling out a little bit more later on, but that's good for now. And I can just copy this as well. All right, so we're going to import connection status from this location. And all right, so right now these are appearing side by side, and that is because this top level styles file, or let me actually close this out. So this is my top level component, and this is the related styles file. And by default, whenever we display by flex, they're displayed in a row, but we can do flex direction flex direction column, and that's going to make sure that those elements appear stacked on top of each other rather than side by side. So now that you kind of get the basics of what I'm going for, build out simple containers just for now and just plop them all in this top level one, I'll go ahead and fast forward the video so you don't have to, see me doing the same thing. All right, so we have the top, then connection status, then it's going to be the main button under that, and then the timer right under the main button. And then at the very bottom, we're going to have that history table. And there we go. So now let's just check. Okay, so our top section, connection status, main button, timer, history, beautiful. Now I know I said right after this, what I was going to do is go through each of these components one by one and kind of do the hi-fi styling of each. But before I even do that, let me just kind of shuffle things around a bit and kind of lay these out so, kind of the spacing between them is a little bit more realistic. I also want to bump these up to the very top, since you can see by this element, I want the very top section to appear at the very top of the app and not just floating in the center. So let me go ahead and do that right now. So to get all of these items floating to the top of this div, what I need to do is go in my styles, and for justify content center, this is actually going to be flex start, and that should bump it to the top. Beautiful. And I also want to change my background, and let me just copy some of these colors from one of my older projects. So the background color, I'm going to have this blue right here, and for the primary color for this font, I'll change that to this white color. Again, I just have one of my older projects on the right side of the screen right here that I'm just stealing some styles from. And another thing that I want is for the height to be a little bit taller than the width. So for the height, again, all of these are probably going to be fine-tuned later on, but for the height, I'll say 80%, and for the width, I'll say 60%. And since we are using percentages, this is going to be kind of relative to the parent, or responsive in a way. But yeah, that looks pretty good so far. And I also want to add some padding. So padding, say 24 pixels. And another thing that I want to mention is that even though I'm hard coding in these hex values right now, what I'm going to do once all this is done is I'm going to go and convert all of these hard coded values into like a color theme. And that way we, for example, whenever we change the text color or background color, we don't have to go and change it in all of these. We just have to change it in that one location. Now, normally I would do this beforehand. For example, if we had a designer and they had a style guide, I would lay everything out beforehand. But since I am the lead developer and product manager and designer and everything in this, it doesn't really matter that much since I'm the only person working on this code. So this works for now. But again, if you're working with a team, you probably want to standardize these things a little bit beforehand. So, okay, got that padding, a nice layout. So now what I want to do is go through each of these and just get the basic spacing for it. So for the connection status, this is going to be a little bit far away from the top, but not as much as the padding. So maybe 12 pixels from this top section. So the connection status, the styles for it, I'll just say margin top, 12 pixels. All right, looking better. Now for the main button, we probably want this quite a bit away from the connection status, since it's like the center item, the main piece. So I'll say margin top, 48 pixels. How's that look? All right, not bad, not bad. For the timer, we can do 12 pixels on that. Oops. And for the history, let's try 48, and then we'll see how everything looks together. Margin top, 48 pixels, and how we looking? All right, pretty good. So yeah, just to get like the generic spacing, again, all of these are going to be tweaked, but once I start styling everything, I want it in roughly the general area that it's going to land up. So, all right, now that we got that taken care of, let's go ahead and start with the top and kind of dig deep into the styling of this. So let me actually make this a wee bit bigger since we are going to be styling everything. And all right, so I'll show you how I'm going to structure this top section right now. So this top container is going to contain both of these elements right here. However, the way that I want to structure it is kind of like this. So I want to have a card, and I'll have the card contain these components. So I'll have a card on the left and a card on the right. And just to kind of show you this, let me send this to back and get some background on here, something like this. So this will be a card, and I'll have two of these. Don't mind my chaotic styling right now, but in one of these cards, I'm gonna have the network info. Okay, this is getting a bit messy, but something like this. So in one of the cards, I'm gonna have this, or excuse me, the account info. In the other card, I'm gonna have the network info. And then both of these cards I'll render in that top section right there, but this way I can kind of split everything up correctly. So I'll make a card component, and then I'll also separate this into its own component. And the reason that I'm doing that is because we are reusing these kind of cluster of elements right here, and we also have it right here. And in addition to those two places for the account and the network, whenever we click this pencil icon and we need to select from one of our devices or accounts and networks, then we're going to be using that same exact styling again there. But anyways, because we're going to be reusing kind of the same generic layout with the logo on the left and text on the right, that's why I'm kind of splitting everything up that way. But for right now, I just want to make these basic cards, and then we'll get our top laid out. So let me just close everything. Close all, and then in our top, so in here we are going to be sticking two cards, and we'll style those in just a bit. But before we even do that, we can actually just style this. So I'll say it's going to be displayed as a flex. And we don't need to do flex direction column because by default it's a row, and we want those cards to appear side by side. Now another cool, it's not even a trick, just a CSS property is gap. And what this allows is, well, it's actually a pretty good description. It's not what I meant to pop open, one sec. Okay, so this gap property in flex elements is just the gap that appears between these items right here. And I actually didn't know about it till recently. Before, what I used to do is I would say like the left card has a right margin of 12 and the right card has a left margin of 12, and it was just kind of a pain. So whoever came up with this property, thank you for saving me a lot of time. And then aside from this, I just want to do justify content center. And the last thing is just width. I need to explicitly say this is going to be 100%. And the reason for that is because this top, I want this to expand basically the full width of the parent, so the cards kind of take up the full space and aren't just floating in the middle. I just think it looks a little bit better that way. But anyways, this is how our cards are going to be laid out. And now let's go ahead and create those cards components. So the way that I like to structure my applications, and I'll show you how I did it in chat, is I have the containers directory right here, and that's the one that we created in the last video. And I also have a components directory. And I think a lot of React applications do this, but the standard that I'm going for is that containers are typically the higher level components that are typically hooked up to Redux. Now, components are, again, these are all components, but as far as naming convention goes, these are going to be like display only components. And when I'm writing components, even though I break this rule sometimes, I try to pass in only primitive data only. So strings, numbers, so on and so forth. And it just kind of helps separate or organize things where all of the Redux is in here, and all the display is in a directory called components. So I don't know, it's been working out so far. So let's go ahead and follow that design pattern. So I'm going to make this directory called components, and in here I'll make our very first component, and that is going to be top card. So this top card component is just going to be like any of our other ones. Oops. And we'll just make a dummy component right now with some styling that we will fill out a little bit later on. But yeah, this is good right now. I just want to have something that we can import and show on the screen. So we'll say import top card from apps, speed test, components, top card. And now that we have that, again, we're going to have two of them, one for the account, one for the network. And this is probably going to be a little bit funky until we get some background action going on here. But there we have our two top card components, and these are both displayed in the top container. So now that we got these, let's just go ahead and make the styling a little bit prettier. Now before we hop into our style file, let's go ahead and think about how we want to structure this. So actually, in addition to all of these, I do want one other thing in here, like a heading of sorts. So something like this. So this is going to say device or account, something like that. And then this one right here is going to say network. But I say this because whenever I'm structuring this top card and deciding what props to pass in, what we'll do is we'll pass in two props. The first one is the text for the heading. And the second one is we're going to be passing in whatever React component we want to display under the heading, and we'll just call this content or something. And the reason that I want to pass in a component rather than all these individual pieces is because whenever we, let me copy this and show you. Whenever we first boot up the app for the very first time, we're not going to have any network selected. So we're going to have some empty state. All right, come on. All right, so we're going to have some empty state, and I don't know exactly what it's going to be, but it's going to say something like select network. I don't know, maybe it's going to be a link or something like this. But either way, by allowing us to pass in a component rather than like a logo and this and that and an action icon, we can just say, give me a header, give me some content to display under, and then it's going to be flexible enough for both of our needs. So might as well keep this here for reference. And okay. So popping back open the top card. Pretty good, huh? All right. Now let me actually go ahead and write these styled components first. So the first thing that I'm going to want to do is create that heading. And I'll say this heading we can make it a heading, but I'll just go ahead and make it a div for now. Maybe not the best practice, but yeah, just the way I style this. And now let me go ahead and copy this color from my other project, and I'll say the font size can be 13 pixels and the font weight can be 500. All right, now to use this for the heading, even though we're going to be passing in a custom prop, which is going to be a string for this, just to get something appearing on the screen, I'll say heading right there. And let me just make sure this, okay, good to go. And now under this heading is where we will have our content. Let me think about this a bit. Okay. So the content, we don't want to add too much styling here since we really want the component that is passed in to have all the styling, but we do want a little bit space between the content, whatever our component is that we pass in, and the heading. So say margin top is 12 pixels, and then just do something like this. Content here, and let's see how this looks. All right, so these are our cards. We have our heading on top, and again, this heading is going to be either account or network, whatever we decide. Then our content, and all right. So before I go any further, what I want to do is actually just style this card as in the entire container. And let me do that right now. So the container or the card itself, we'll say that it has this slight blue background. There you go. I don't know if you can see it yet, but this card background has a slightly different shade of blue than our main or primary background. And then after this, I want to add a little border radius as well, since the square cards weren't looking that great. And let's see. Yeah, let me just display it as flex, because we have two items in here, the heading and the content, and they are always going to be displayed in a column. So might as well just kind of standardize. So display flex, and then I can do flex 1 to stretch it out. The flex direction, want to make sure that's a column, because remember by default it's going to be a row, since I want those elements to stack on top of each other. There you go. And for padding, so everything isn't just butted up against the edge, we'll do 10 pixels, 14 pixels, and then we'll see how these cards are looking. All right, looking good. Look at that. Okay, so I think this is pretty good right now for these top cards. Actually, what I probably can do is I can create the element for this. So this is actually pretty interesting. So we know that we have this heading in the content section right now, and we're flexible to pass anything into the, let me get this on the screen, the content. But what I want to do is actually take these 3 UI elements, and I want to make a separate component out of this. And I do not want to include this action button in this component right here. And I don't want to do that because, like I said, whenever we click this, it's going to pop up a modal, and that modal is going to have a list of these accounts or networks. And whenever we use that UI, that is not going to have this action button on the right. So I'll create a component for this little layout right here, and I'll call it like identification, since that's really all these labels are. If you see in both the whenever you add an account or you add a network, all of this information, including display name, the logo, and the identifier, it's really just like a label for yourself to easily identify this stuff. So I call it identification. Ugh, can't talk today, but yeah, with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So let me go ahead and pop open this again. Get rid of that for now. Okay, so we're going to be creating 2 more components. One is called identification. Make sure I spelled that right. And the other is, well, we'll get to that in a second. So for the identification, just go ahead and create a new component. I'm too lazy to type that out again, so call this identification and style file. And for this identification component, it's just going to be this right here. So since this is the component, I'll have a flex layout, and I can just keep the default. It's not going to be stacked as a column. It'll have this image on the left and then this text on the right. And then inside this text, I'll break it down into top text right here and bottom text right there. So in identification, the first thing I want to do is for the main container, I'll just display it as flex. And then actually might as well create these separate elements right now. So For the image, again, this is not going to be a div. It's going to be an image tag. So we can just say style.img. And I want the image to be circular. So I'm going to do border radius 50%. And then I'll just do I'll give it a height of 36. I think that's what the size of those other ones are. Height, width. So this is going to make sure that it's always a square circle. And then since I want a little bit of space between this image and this text right here, I'll add a margin right. I keep clicking open the wrong thing. Embarrassing. So say margin right is 10 pixels. It should be good for now. All right, so now let's go ahead and stick that in there. So s.image, and since that's an image tag, we have source. And just to test, let me go in my GitHub, and actually I can just get it from here. I just need like a sample URL. Eventually this is all going to be coming from Redux, of course. But for now, just get some dummy data in there. Let's give some alt text. Identification, there we go. And then to the right of this is where we're going to have our text. So I'll just say that, actually maybe I'll do this. So I'm going to have a main div for both of these. And then I'll have divs inside them for the top and bottom, just so we can get our main layout taken care of. So text, and then I'm going to have top text, and then bottom text. All right, so our main layout is just going to have two components, an image to the left and the text area to the right. And inside the text, I'm going to have the top text and then bottom text. Now, even though eventually we're going to be passing this in dynamically as a prop, as content, for now, just to make sure everything is looking right, we'll say imports identification. Apps, speed test, components, identification. And for the content, that's where we're going to have our identification. And now we should have something on the screen looking good. All right, so now let's go ahead and just style this top and bottom text for this identification and check it out. So for the top text, we can have this a whitish color, and let's go with 14 pixels. And for the bottom text, we can keep the default color for this. We'll say the font size a little bit smaller, maybe 12 pixels. And because I want the bottom text a little bit bumped down, we'll say margin top, and we'll say 2 pixels. All right, and now let's add some sample network data in here. So we'll say TNB, the new Boston network. Again, all of this is going to be programmed later, but just want some realistic data. Sometimes you have like lorem ipsum or dummy data, and it just it's like not the right content length, or I don't know. You have to go back and later and tweak things. So looking good. And now top card, change this to network. All right, so yeah, everything is hard coded in for the time being, but that's the basic structure we're looking for. Now, another thing that I want to do, and this may seem like overkill, but I think it's going to work out, is that we are not going to be actually passing this identification node in here directly. Even when we have a network, for example, we're either going to be passing in this like empty state, as you can call it, or this network component. However, instead of just passing it in, kind of like a raw dog in it, I want to pass in something where we can have this layout. And this layout right here is just going to have this component on the left and then another component on the right hand side. But I want to space them so they take up the full width of the card. And again, like I said, it may seem like overkill, but I'm going to make another component just for this layout. So in this components, I'm going to make one more component called spaced items. And again, the only point of this is just so I can have a nice layout to space out two things evenly. All right, so let me close these for now. And what is spaced items going to do? Well, for this main layout, what we want to do is we want to display it as flex direction row, since things are going to be appearing left and right. And for the items, I'm going to want those center aligned, and this is the vertical alignment. And let me just sort those lines. So the vertical alignment is going to be centered, and for justified content, that's going to be space between. And what that's going to do is pretty much just make sure that this section appears to the leftmost as we can, and that this icon appears to the rightmost as we can, and just take up the full width of the card basically. All right, so there we go. And now what I can do is probably this. So I'm gonna have a left div and a right div, and probably an icon as well, but this should be good for now. So yeah, in here, in the spaced items, I'm gonna say left, and then this is gonna be right. And in that left section, I'm gonna move this identification component over. Again, all of this stuff is gonna be passed in dynamically, but for now, just hard code everything in. Okay. And now that we have our UI elements being rendered in the space items component, rather than just hard coding it into this top card, what I'm actually going to do is this. All right, so I know this looks kind of cluttered, but as we kind of build this out, I think it'll make sense why. Okay, so check it out. So now in this card, we're passing in the spaced item component. And in the spaced item component, we can have two components, one thing on the left, which is our identification, and one thing on the right, which is going to be that pencil icon. So let's go ahead and figure out how to do that pencil icon right now. So what we can do is we can replace this right text here. And okay, so again, this is going to be being passed in as a React node. However, for the time being, I'm just going to hard code this in to show you how to work with the icons, and then it's going to be a piece of cake to pull out in just a second. So in TNBOS, I already have material icons installed. So and the package is at mdi/js, we want to pull out the icon that we want to use, and everything is prefixed with MDI. Oh, look at that, pencil right there. So in order to use one of these icons, actually, let's go ahead and make this a styled component and save the time. So in the styles for here, right under styled components, what I want to do from actually MDI React, I'm going to be importing the icon for it, and I'm going to call it U, which is kind of a shorthand for unstyled, MDI icon. And this is just the icon component. Now, the reason that I want to import it right here in styled components is because, well, I'll show you in just a second. Actually, let me write this out so it makes sense. So I'm gonna create a styled component called icon, and what this is it's a styled version of this component right here. So whenever you work with styled icons, you don't always just have to style HTML elements right here. You can actually style other React components, and this just like kind of applies additional styles to them on top of any styles that they already have, just naturally, I guess you could say. And for this, we're going to be adding some CSS in here in just a bit, but just to kind of get everything hooked up, on the right hand side, I can then say display my icon right like that. It's going to take a path, and that path is going to be pencil. And for the size of this, which it also takes, we'll say that this is going to be 28 pixels. So again, this is the exact same thing than if you were to do something like this. This is perfectly valid as well. However, the reason that I structure it this way is because we want to apply our own custom styles to this icon. And what are those styles? Great question. So the first thing I want to do is I want to give it a border radius of 50%, make sure that this appears circular. And the color of this, I'm going to be using this like gray blue color. And I also want to give it a padding of 4 pixels, just so the icon isn't butted right up against the edges. And because I have this padding of 4 pixels and the card itself also has padding, it's gonna look a little bit, it's gonna look like it has too much padding on the right hand side. So to kind of compensate for this, I'm gonna do margin right, and I'm gonna take away those 4 pixels of padding. So, okay, border radius, color, margin right, padding, and another thing that I can do, actually, let me see if it just displays right here. Okay, so this is the icon right here. And what I want to do is whenever we hover over this, I want to change the background of it and also the color. And I also want to change my cursor right here to a pointer just to give the user some indication that they are indeed hovering over it. So in order to do that, I do ampersand, the hover state, and for the background, actually, let me get this background in color. Background and color, a nice, some shades of blue, and then for the cursor, I'll just do pointer. All right, so now when I hover over it, you see we get this cool little hover state. And just to spice things up a little bit, I'm gonna add a transition so it kind of fades rather than popping in. Just makes it look a little bit more professional. And I'll say 0.15 seconds. Now, when I hover over it, well, you probably can't tell, but I can. It's subtle, but there's this fade rather than just, you know, popping to this different state. Makes it feel a little bit more professional, you know? So I think that this is probably good for these top cards. The only other UI element that we really have to write for these top cards is whatever we decide to do about our empty state element right here. But we'll actually save this for later on once we, right around the time we actually hook this into Redux. And the reason for that is just because the way I am building out the UI right now, it'll be kind of a pain to have this identification UI element and then an empty state both. So we'll save that for later. Don't have to build out, you know, every single UI element just in this step. So yeah, in the next tutorial, we'll go to the connection status styling and then kind of just work our way down from here. Then once we have everything styled, then we'll start hooking everything up. So on that note, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next video.